Welcome to Preservation Perspectives. I'm your host, Monica Rhodes. I think we as preservationists can all agree on the importance of volunteers to what we do. It's absolutely critical. Some of the very first volunteers in the preservation movement helped preserve some of our iconic places around the country. In fact, a lot of the work of volunteerism is embedded within the National Park Service, both on the sites that we preserve and the communities that it took to get them to be national parks, as well as the volunteers who are the lifeblood of the parks and help them keep going. So our guest today shares a similar story of his neighborhood in New Orleans, Louisiana, in the Faubourg Marigny neighborhood. Eugene Cizek was one of the volunteers who led the movement to preserve this neighborhood. Gene is a preservationist who has served as an architect at Tulane University. He's also a professor and a city planner. So welcome, Gene, to Preservation Perspectives.
Thank you.
So we're going to jump right into these questions. So, Gene, where is Faubourg Marigny neighborhood and what's its history?
Faubourg Marigny is the neighborhood just downriver from the French Quarter, or the Viewx Carrie, which is the French Quarter is the original city of New Orleans, and the Faubourg Marigny is made up of two sections. One's called the Triangle, the other is called the Rectangle, and the Triangle was the original, what they call Land of the King. It was that sort of area set aside should the monarch ever wish to really do anything down here. It was the land that was reserved for development use, basically by the public. Initially, it was given over to a very wealthy colonialist. New Orleans was founded in 1718, and Faubourg Marigny was originally a plantation that was just downriver from the French Quarter, right, on the Mississippi River, just like the quarter. And there was but Marigny, the family Marigny of the Philippe family, they ended up building like a dam on the river so that water could come in, and it ran a large lumber mill, which of course they used to make a lot of money and also to provide a lot of materials to use in building the new city.
Wow, yeah, that's critically important, and I'm sure was central to the work that you helped lead as you were thinking about what parts of the story do we need to pull out as we're talking to the elected officials, that we're talking to communities that may not know this history. So with that in mind, what was happening in the 60s in this neighborhood that led to the preservation efforts?
Well, in the 60s, there was a great deal. There had just been a mayor who proceeded to tear down some of the most important landmarks we had in the city. And now we were under new leadership. And I moved here in 1970, actually to be a professor, a visiting professor at Tulane. And to start there, I was the first student in their interdisciplinary PhD program. So I was a student, a faculty member, and then I also was working for the neighborhood of, was called the Community Improvement Agency in and for the city of New Orleans. It was a state agency, but it was to basically run the urban renewal program of New Orleans. The state of Louisiana was one of the last places that urban renewal was allowed to be for like residential use. Before that, all property that was given to the city or taken by the city was for like a major city project, something public. And I had become very much involved in the preservation movement when I went to MIT after I finished my degree in architecture from LSU. And at MIT, there was a beginning of the Back to the City movement out of New York. And so I used to attend a lot of their meetings. And so I began my involvement in preservation in the 1960s.
And I think it's interesting, as you called out, the response to the preservation of the neighborhood was to a mayor who was demolishing everything. And I think So much of what we do is, mostly in response to, but there's also times where we're trying to get ahead of things.
Right.
And I think that's important, this activist lens that runs through our work. So from your perspective, why was it significant that the neighborhood be declared a historic district? What does it mean to be a historic district from your experience?
Well, in New Orleans, the main areas that people knew about and really that were protected, the Viewx Carrie was protected actually in the state constitution. That went into effect in the 1930s. And then the Garden District, which is where a lot of the really wealthy Americans lived. And New Orleans was sort of divided into two areas. There was the American sector, which was above Canal Street, and there was the Creole sector, which was below Canal Street. And the Creole sector was basically the part that was based on the old Latin culture of France and then Spain. And under Spain, New Orleans really kind of boomed. And the Faubourg Marigny was this plantation that had been used for growing different kinds of plant materials. And then, of course, there was the very large lumber mill. And Pierre de Marigny, who was one of the people who basically actually built the plantation house, it was the largest property that was ever built during the colonial period and was filled with great, beautiful furniture and paintings and pictures. And the Marignys were very much socially concerned people. In fact, Bernard de Marigny had a half sister who was her mother was a Congo woman that was employed in the Marigny household, and she had a child with Philippe before he married the Destrehan daughter. And the Destrehan family was a very wealthy family, as were the Marignys. When Bernard, his father died in 1800, Bernard was 15 years old, and he was considered to be the richest person in the United States. So he had, he had come from a family that was always concerned about doing good things for the city and, of course, the country they were loyal to at the time, which was Spain.
And this is an important call out here. So there's, the French Quarter is the nation's oldest historic district, established in 1925. So, New Orleans has this legacy of preservation activities, and the preservation of this neighborhood falls right in line with that. Gene, from your experience with the volunteerism in preservation, can you talk about how important it is to have volunteers driving this movement or a part of this movement in some way?
Well, it's critical because it's the volunteers in these neighborhood groups, and New Orleans is made up of, well, many neighborhoods, but they're like, we once only had the French Quarter and the Garden District. We now have 16 historic districts. But in order to get districts beyond those two in other cities in Louisiana, we had to rewrite the state constitution. And so we had to do that. We also had to, campaign locally with the council people. And in 1970, when I moved here, we had just elected a new mayor. It was his name was Moon Landreau, a great mayor. He actually, under Jimmy Carter, he was a Secretary of Urban Affairs, a great civic person. And he's the one that kind of integrated the city government and began to promote through a great deal from it, through the efforts that my neighborhood and I were doing, that we need to preserve more than just the two neighborhoods that were famous. We needed to preserve basically most of New Orleans would be eligible under the guidelines for National Register areas. The whole city basically could fill those guidelines. But there was this movement by a lot of the mainly Americans above Canal who felt that, we needed high rises and a riverfront expressway. And it was really what they call the Riverfront Expressway, which would have put an I-10 kind of highway right through on the Mississippi River in front of all of the French Quarter. It would start
Yep.
in the Marigny, and then when it got to Canal Street, it would go underground. And then from there, I don't think they were quite sure where it would go, but they knew they were going to build it. And of course,
Yeah.
we had a lot of the big planners from New York City and places like that were down here calling the cards. Very early on, the Riverfront Expressway began as a public program in 1946. So you had these people in the quarter, and a lot. The preservation movement in New Orleans has been very much led by women who were concerned about the future of the city and making a city that people kind of would know where they're at and where they're from. And interestingly enough, the gay community. You had all of these men who were, many of these men were powerful. They had good jobs. They were leaders. And so you have this interesting mixture of, as they used to say, little old ladies in tennis shoes, but most of our little old ladies were wearing, high heels. And there was one lady, Martha Robinson, who became one of my best friends because I ended up doing the final study of the Riverfront Expressway. And we had found out that I was supposed to be clearing the path for it. And about the time that would have started to be built, we were fighting it. And a big movement. And it was an international movement because I think people have always recognized the importance of the French Quarter.
Yeah.
You have these activities going on. In 1960, 67% of the central business district had been demolished for parking lots. And so we did not want our neighborhood, which I looked at as being a great place that people could move to, even though the houses needed help. It had great people living here, but there were a lot of abandoned houses. And so this was a much better form of renewal, urban renewal to me than tearing stuff down and building things back. And so they had a new mayor, they had a new director of the Community Improvement Agency, and I became the acting director of preservation and planning for the Urban Renewal Authority. And we started by getting first the mayor on board, and of course the director of that group was a classmate of mine from MIT. He's 1 year ahead of me, and so we started this movement along with all these other people. And preservation, the the Junior League here in New Orleans was also very much involved in trying to put a better front on what the city was doing, and basically fighting demolition and promoting preservation. So it was an interesting group of people working together.
Yeah, so I have two questions on that. I mean, I've been to New Orleans a fair number of times, and I remember there was a project I worked on. There are two cemeteries, St. Louis Cemetery number 2 and 3. There's the I-10 that runs right above it. What were preservationists doing during that moment in time where they were running the highway through a historic neighborhood as well as close to a historic cemetery?
They were fighting, but there were again a group of businessmen, and the Catholic Church was also more on the business people's side. There was even an attempt to tear down St. Louis number 2 and sell it to developers for high rises. But that roadway was put in place by one of these plans that had come down from New York City, and a lot of their planners same planners that were messing up New York were down here messing up New Orleans. Claiborne Avenue, which is where that I-10 part was built, was a beautiful avenue of 5 live oak trees across, and streetcars in the middle. And so the people who lived along it would use that beautiful greenway as a place to have picnics and parties and celebrations. And here we like to second line, dance around and stuff like that. And that's what it was used for. But this developer from New York basically looked at it, it's open space.
Yeah.
So we can cut down all the trees. People fought that, but they cut them down. And I have seen videos of that, and people were out there protesting even at that point in time. But it went through what had been an area of the city that was a mixed neighborhood, but it had a lot of people living there that were not necessarily of what power could be if volunteers got together and got organized. Mm-hmm. And that's what we began doing in 1970, was getting people organized all over the city and making them understand that these old neighborhoods were a better example of urban renewal. Here you had these houses that were built, many of them long ago, but out of wood that you couldn't even get anymore. And, there was, all they usually needed was to fix their roof. And so as they working in urban renewal, there was one neighborhood, Central City, which is now, it's been much of it restored and redeveloped, and is the site of a lot of wonderful new venues for tourists and a restaurant here, for instance, cannot survive just on tourists. You have to have people from the community that like to go there, and so that helps keep a lot of our prices down for restaurants, even though they have gone up in the last few years. But that's how we got organized. And I was teaching at Tulane, and I always felt when I was teaching that the students should be involved in real projects. Mm-hmm. So I had been working on the Riverfront project, and then the director of city planning at that time said, for instance, for Marigny, Gene, can you and your students go into Faubourg Marigny? Now, they weren't calling it Faubourg, that was the original name, but the word Faubourg wasn't being used anymore. It is now used, and a lot of names that were historical names are all very popular names now. Okay. And we have a street called Frenchman Street that is probably second only, unfortunately, to Bourbon Street, because it's sort of gotten too popular. Too many bars, too many music venues, and it's a constant battle. Once you do something that is working, it seems like the developers come in and they, we want to make money too, and they try to overdo it. So it's a people who care about their neighborhoods. It's a constant battle of keeping the developers under control. Because they see these historic neighborhoods now, which are beautiful, full of great old houses, nice people. It's an opportunity for them to make a great deal of money, but it's also an opportunity to create places for people to live. And like right now, one of our biggest battles in the city is short-term rentals. And these people come in. What happens with short-term rentals, we find, is that there's nobody left to vote. So if you don't have somebody left to vote, how are you going to control what happens to your neighborhood? So it's a new battle that we have to deal with.
It's a battle. It's a battle and a balance for sure on short-term. Right. Yeah. So here's the other thing, Gene, I've heard you share, and I just kind of want to pull out these pieces. And so a second ago, you were talking about how you engage with the elected officials, how you got, folks were organized. I am a consultant, and I have a number of clients that I'm working with where we're having the same conversation on the importance of getting organized and speaking with one voice. So I want to hear a little bit more about how do you take someone from I want to do something and then activating them into a collective group of people who are then focused on achieving that goal. So what was that like to get people organized and to get the elected officials on your side, which we both know is not the easiest thing to do sometimes?
Well, first you have to find out what people are thinking. And so my students and the classes I taught at Tulane, I'm retired now, but the classes I taught were never just a class. It was always work. We always worked on a community project. So we would go into the neighborhoods, like in Faubourg Marigny, our first areas of finding out what was going on. We go to laundromats where people are washing their clothes and sitting there and talking. Go to bars where people also are sitting and talking. Go to the grocery stores and just basically become a part of the community. And so what my students would often do, they would often go find a place to somebody in that neighborhood we were studying to go live there. And we would organize, we would work, and then we started working with the neighbors in the areas and getting the folks organized and setting up improvement associations like the Faubourg Marigny Improvement Association. We're a major political force. We're not the biggest, but I think in many ways we're most to take on somebody who's trying to destroy our neighborhood. And if we need to go work with other neighborhoods, we do that. And through that process, we founded a group called the Preservation Resource Center of New Orleans. And that was initially everybody on the board. It was usually the president of one of the neighborhood associations. People were looking for places to live in the old city. It had become popular to live in an old house again. When I first moved here, a lot of architects would say, "Oh, I hate shotgun houses. You know, you have to walk through all the rooms, et cetera, et cetera." Well, now shotgun houses are very popular. You can turn them into all kinds of interesting dwellings. And those buildings are built out of materials that you can't even find anymore today. And so by showing people, we had a program called the Building Watchers Tour, where we would put a house that's been restored on tour with a house that was being restored. And so you'd have these, they were inexpensive, $2 a person bus tours that would go into the neighborhood and go see a house that was completely restored to show them, hey, this is what it could look like. And then we'd go visit a house that was being restored. And we'd also go look at some houses that were ripe for work, meaning they were on the market. And of course, in the 70s, you could buy a wonderful, my first house cost me $20,000.
But Gene, don't tell me that. Don't tell me $20,000 for a house.
The lady I bought it from had bought it 6 months earlier for 14. But you couldn't borrow money down here. Below Canal Street. And to borrow money, you had to be living in the American sector. So the business of being American versus Creole was a really big deal. And finally, one of the really old savings and loan associations and a young vice president at one of the big banks decided, well, they were preservationists. And so they managed to get long-term loans and interim financing available in their banks. And when we did that, that made a big difference. The other thing we had to do was get rid of redlining for insurance. You couldn't buy insurance down here, and the appraisals you got for property below the quarter were not very good. Most of these people on the appraisal boards were from Metairie, which is a suburb of New Orleans. And so they didn't know anything about the old city. So we had to take them on too. We never actually had to go to court, but we had money committed by people in the neighborhoods and people who cared about our neighborhoods, saying that, okay, if you want to fight, we'll fight. And we would threaten a lawsuit, and it just doesn't stop. Right now, we've got one of the Marriott wants to build a hotel that's 4 times bigger than what the zoning allows for a neighborhood for an area in my neighborhood. And so it's a constant battle with them. And of course, when you get in the hotels and the short-term rentals, the prices go up for regular people who would like to live here. And how we deal with that problem is, it's going to take, we're working on it.
Yeah. I certainly, I'm hearing this and I'm thinking through it comes down to money and messaging and being consistent with your message, and then having the funding to support these activities and to wage these battles. You have to get the courts involved sometimes, or you have to this bus tour. Those funds that were raised to take people on these tours, that fund the Faubourg Marigny Neighborhood Association or Political Association? Or was
the money at that time went into developing the Preservation Resource Center, which gave us money to organize, to print materials, to put on programs, and also to go and get involved in politics. So I remember one day I was working with my partner at the time, who was a public school teacher, and we had a program called Education Through Historic Preservation. Now, in 1981, the National Trust gave us the first honor award in education, and we worked with kids. So we would sometimes have maybe 200 children in the audience at a council meeting, and they would stand up and they'd say, "Preserve. We don't want that building. You shouldn't tear that building down." And sometimes these kids would go up and they would speak at the speaker. So they were learning how to be organized citizens, as well as they were drawing and writing plays. I'm involved. The art students drew images about what we were doing. The English students in their classes, they wrote plays about these places we would adopt. And this went on for almost 40 years. And several of the organizations in town now carry on these programs. And we actually we took that program to China, to Japan. We had a big group going in England, but the main area we focus on is here in Louisiana, and particularly in New Orleans. Without New Orleans, the state of Louisiana really cannot operate. They think they can, but they can't.
Yeah. I mean, Gene, that's incredible. I mean, giving young people the opportunity to be involved, because they do care, right? They have these thoughts, they're in neighborhoods as well, and they often don't have an opportunity to share their voice about how they're feeling their perspective. So that is a wonderful, wonderful program.
They also can go home and start talking to their parents about these projects they're working on. And then the parents, all of a sudden, many times we find the parents become involved, and then they become more, I'll call them warriors, because that's what they are. Yeah. You have to have warriors on your side to go out and to be willing to fight. And that's not all you do. When you fight, you also have fun. And we like to party, and all the old neighborhoods in New Orleans, give us a chance to, have a party. Parties become organizing ways.
Right. You're partying for a purpose.
That is right. That is right.
And again, the importance of civic engagement cannot be understated. Like you can't complain about things that are going on in the city and be unwilling to roll up your sleeves and get involved. And so that's an important call out. So here I have a question for you, Jenny. This is like my last question. What are you up to now? Do you still live in Marigny? I know you said you are currently in battle with short-term rentals. What else?
I am sitting right now in a house that was the worst house I have ever restored. I bought it for $40,000 in 1976. So by 76, prices have started to go up. But it cost me $250,000 to restore it. It's a big house, and it took a lot of money. And the mortgage rates were at 8%. If you had 8%, we thought we were lucky. People gripe about mortgage rates today. Back in those days, if you had 8%, you were really lucky. 13, 14, 15, interim financing was 20%. And there were months that I didn't have any money to pay that interim financing. And one month that I always love to tell people about, because they think it's probably not real, but it's true. I had to sell the burial policy that my mom and dad had taken out for me when I was a kid to pay the interim financing that month. And I'd go to like a Chinese, I love Chinese food. So I'd go to a Chinese restaurant and I get my, my fortune cookie, and I'd look at it and I'd say, oh my God, I take it all literally. And my friends would say, don't take it so literally, you're going to make it. And I did. I made it. That's where I still live today. And the neighborhood is improved, but it's also gotten very expensive. I think, and again, the short-term rentals, we have way too many of them. I can sit on my front gallery and just meet people from all over the world. But those people coming in, you can influence them as well. And if you give them the right words to say, and you'd say, why don't you write my congressman, or why don't you write my senator and promote and you give them something to say and how to say it. And you know what? We get letters of support when they have projects going on from people from all over the world. And that makes them sit up and say, oh, we can't ignore this anymore. And so you try to elect new council people and new mayors and it's like the people that are going to be running for mayor this next time. One of them is a woman who was a person on television. She was a, what do you call, host. And so and then one of the guys that's interested is his mother was the teacher of the Little Red Schoolhouse in the French Quarter. French Quarter has had a school in the quarter since the very beginning. And so and that teacher there has always been involved in getting the kids involved in the neighborhood and getting the neighborhood involved in the kids. And so, I remember bouncing him on my knee when he was just a little boy, and I was talking to his mother about getting involved with the kids there and then my students would act as teachers as well. Some of them didn't like it. Oh, Gene, I don't want to be it. Well, I don't want to do this. I say, you're going to do it and you're going to enjoy it. And guess what? They always did.
Of course.
The one who was the worst, I'm not going to do that, would be the first one to say, oh my God, these are my kids. I got to work for them. And we'd go to their graduations and we'd cry when, they would cry when we leave. And it was just, it gets the kids involved, and you get, and my students are from all over the place at Tulane. So you get that kind of involvement, which is good. And of course, I wish the university at Tulane would get more involved in these things, and they do and they don't. Right now, in order to graduate from Tulane, you have to have a certain number of hours of community involvement, which I think is a good idea.
Yep. Because you're sending these young adults out into the world, and they should be prepared to use their voices and the power that they do have to affect the change that they want to see.
Right.
So
and what they learn here, they can take with them and start back in wherever the new job is. And so I'm real. I started the Master's of Preservation Studies program at Tulane about 30 years ago, and I'm so proud of where we are. They're all over the place, and they're all doing incredible things, and they keep me posted as what's going on, and it makes you realize that teaching is a wonderful occupation. I also was a practicing architect, but my first love has always been teaching.
Yeah, and Gene, and that comes out even in this conversation. This has been absolutely incredible. Even hearing about how, even though you're fighting against the short-term rentals and trying to seek a balance there, you're still leveraging the power of the people who stay in those rentals to advocate for preservation.
That's right.
If that's not creating an opportunity in the situation, I don't know what is.
Yeah, if they have a good time,
yeah,
talk about that good time, and they become part of your friend base this way. But volunteers are so critical. That's really how I think good government is run today. And to me, preservation is the best form of community renewal. It gives people a place to know that when they're in this place, they know where they're from, and they have a much better idea of maybe where they may be going. So that I think that's important for children in particular, to know that I'm a person, I'm here, and I have a future. And if you have the future around them is composed of buildings that have been there a long time, I think it gives them a sense of pride, as also a sense of stability, which I think they need today.
Gene, I couldn't have said it better myself, and that is a great point for us to end our conversation on. Thank you so much for joining the discussion today. I thoroughly enjoyed chatting with you.
Well, it's great speaking with you.
Thank you for joining our conversation today. Please be sure to follow the ACHP on our social media channels to keep up with the latest with what's going on in our world of preservation. I am Monica Rhodes, and thank you for joining us on Preservation Perspectives.